Today, I am very pleased to be joined by two experts in education. Cheryl Bost, who is the president of the Maryland State Education Association, MSEA, and Tonya Sweat, who is the vice president of the Maryland PTA for advocacy. So we have two individuals who have been in the headlines recently as we are talking about what's going to happen this fall with our schools. Both of these individuals are representing the educators of Maryland who are so interested in making sure they do what's right in educating our children. I don't know of anyone who doesn't want to see our schools reopen, but they want to see our schools reopen in a safe manner. We've gone through a very difficult time with this pandemic, and we saw as schools closed in March, and Maryland was the second state in the nation to close their schools, that we had serious challenges of children who had a very difficult time connecting through virtual learning. They did not have, in some cases, the technology, and the school systems did not set up the type of environment which allowed access to education. So we had challenges, and we now have tried to deal with those challenges, recognizing that this coronavirus is going to be with us for a long time. We recognize we cannot go back to the pre-COVID days at this point. We're going to have to do things differently. So what preparations have been made? So the first question is, where do we go from here? Maryland's a state that has seen a stabilization of our virus rates. We have not seen the decline to the low level that we would like to have by now, but we certainly have stabilized the situation at a much lower level than we've seen, for example, in the South, which has a spike and is now the hotspot for the virus, as we see record numbers in our country on the spread, the community spread of COVID-19. So in Maryland, our school systems are making decisions as to what they're going to do come this fall with our schools. And two of the players that have had a great deal to say about this have been Cheryl Bost, who represents the teachers in Maryland, and Tonya Sweat, who represents the Parent Teachers Association. So let me start by asking our two guests to give us where they see the play right now in Maryland, as far as what is likely to happen this fall and where they would like to see us, how they'd like to see us consider the reopening of our schools in the fall. So Cheryl, I'll start with you, give you an opportunity. And again, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me, and I'm pleased to represent our over 75,000 educators, teachers, paraprofessionals, cafeteria workers, administrators, everybody across the state who in March really rose up and did a big job in crisis learning. There's no perfect way to open up our schools, but there is a safe way. And that's why the PTA, our Baltimore Teachers Union, and MSEA got together and came out with a position that we believe schools should start through virtual learning. As you stated, we missed out for so many students when we went into crisis learning in the spring through lack of devices for students, connectivity, even education on the platforms that we were using. And many of our educators didn't have that access to that either. But we believe if we can focus our time, our energy, and our resources on one model and really get it right, making sure we reach all students, they're educated on the platforms that we're using, that we can reach out to all of them and make sure that they're actually engaging in learning with their educators, that's where we have to start, because our schools right now are not set up to be safe. We don't have the resources, the funding, and all the gear to start out with social distancing, masks, and taking care of all individuals, including many of our educators and students who have underlying health conditions. And how do we work through that? So we feel that this is a safe way to open our schools, because health and safety has to be the top priority. And then districts can start moving into possibly phasing populations of students into schools. We're proud to see that many of the school systems are going down this path for their plan. Yesterday, Prince George's County announced that that's how they're going to start. Today, Harford County announced that's how they're going to begin. And it really is a way to get this right, the virtual learning right, and then we can move on. So we are proud of the voices of our educators that are taking part in this discussion at the district level. We're also proud to be partnered with the PTA and making sure that parents also have a voice in this.
PTA. So, Tonya,
And
tell us the role that you've played in regards to how decisions are being made by our local school systems on how to start educating this fall.
thank you, Senator Carvin, for having me today. And yes, Maryland PTA is very integral in the planning stages for returning our students safely. We've been working with MSDE on its external stakeholder group to discuss the guidelines that the State Department of Education put out for local school systems to follow. But we were concerned. And we're concerned because not only do we work with the State Department of Education, Maryland PTA also has a partnership with the State Education Association. We work with the association that represents our state superintendents. We also serve on coalitions that work with other special interest groups and educational advocates across the state. And in talking with our partners and our colleagues, we realized that we're not ready. We're not there yet. There's too much we don't know yet about the coronavirus and how it could or will affect children. What we do know is that there will be a lot of adults who come in contact with our children. And we have a very good idea of what the virus will do to adults who contract it. I mean, we've had school systems in the state that have lost teachers to the coronavirus. And so we were very concerned with what we see here in the state and what we're seeing and hearing nationally. And we know that our schools they don't have the resources. Many of our schools are overcrowded. When you have a high school with 3,000 students in it, there's no way you can effectively social distance those teenagers to keep them from passing this communicable disease around. When you have a cafeteria that is built for 250 students to eat lunch, but on a daily basis, we crowd 400 to 500 students during one lunch period to eat lunch in a 30-minute window. That's not a safe environment to re-enter our children. We were very pleased when the schools were closed at the beginning of the pandemic, because keeping our kids at home is the best way a parent knows to keep a child safe. And I will tell you, not all of our parents agree with not reopening the schools in the fall. There are some parents who need their children to go back to school so that they can go back to work. We understand that. But what we don't want to see happen is that our children's lives are put in harm's way simply to protect the economy, simply to allow adults to go back to work, because our schools are not babysitters. They're there to educate our babies. And if they're not healthy, if the teachers can't come into work because they've contracted the virus unintentionally from one of the children, and we can't find the substitutes to fill in for them on a long-term basis, then what good are we really doing? And so evaluating everything we learned from the State Department of Education and from our other partners, Maryland PTA felt the only appropriate thing to do was to take a stand and say, we need to look at public health first in this instance and figure out a way to educate our children and do it sufficiently so that we can get them back into the classroom to rehabilitate and accelerate any learning that might be lost during this pandemic.
Thank you for that. You're both are making a compelling case that for most, if not all, of our school districts in Maryland, we don't have the game plan in place to reopen in a traditional sense this fall. That we are better taking a slower path to make sure that when students come back into a building, it's done in a very safe environment. That's something I think we all agree with. There may come a time that students will re-enter our schools. And for example, we asked for questions on Facebook Live. Megan asks a question from Gaithersburg. Many school staff are older, have health risks, or care for families with serious risks. What is the plan to keep these staff members safe? So let us assume that a school district or a school has a game plan in place to protect the students as they should, but you have an educator who is at great risk and cannot comfortably get into that environment and be able to do his or her job, what accommodations can be made in that circumstance? Either one of you.
So that is a concern of our educators and going back in, and that's why this virtual start is key. We also are recommending to districts to survey their educators, see how many of them have the underlying conditions or face that they're taking care of elderly parents or at-risk students or somebody else in their family that's at risk, so that when we do begin in a safe manner to hopefully come back into school using a hybrid model, that these educators can then do digital learning for students who can't come back or for parents who wish not to have their students back in the school. So doing some pairing up of continuous digital learning with then transitioning into the hybrid is a way that we can look at this. And we're going to need to survey educators to see who has those underlying conditions and who is at risk. And that's the reason to delay moving into that hybrid, is to gain this information and then gain what supports we need to put into our schools. If I could say, Senator Cardin, when this became a health issue, we saw governments across this state, federal, state, and local, that wanted to move mountains to make sure that our healthcare workers were protected, that we turned the convention center into a hospital, that, I mean, we even received tests from South Korea in the state of Maryland. We're not seeing that same urgency happening when we're talking about opening up our schools. In fact, Governor Hogan put forth cuts to funding. So we are going to need to increase and treat this as a true crisis, identifying who has those conditions, identifying what protections that we can put in place. It has to really be an all hands on deck to deal with those safety issues and deal with the individuality of people's issues at home.
Classroom teacher in elementary school, and we're proud of your work in Baltimore County, 2003 Teacher of the Year. Have you heard of school districts as to how they would deal with some just fundamental issues if they were to reopen? Let me just go to a question asked by Tammy on Facebook, which says, if we open, will there be funds or materials for safe spacing, specifically with classrooms that have tables, get desks so students can be separated in a room? Will a whole class have to be quarantined if a student or teacher gets sick? What will you do if you cannot get willing substitutes? Have you seen the detailed answers to those questions in Baltimore County or any of our subdivisions?
To come up with those details. Each division is trying to come up with those details. The State Department has put some items in their reopening plan, like what happens if somebody is identified as being exposed to COVID, and how does the notification take place? How does that isolation take place of possibly the classroom, the school, or maybe even the entire district? So there are plans that are probably farther along for that. But as Tonya was saying, some of our schools house 2,000, 3,000 students. They're overcrowded in their classrooms. We have not seen the full-scale plans on how we can do social distancing. And then you have to talk about passing each other in the hallway, using bathrooms, eating lunch. All of those things have to be exactly planned. Cleaning between classes. What about our shop classes, our career technology education and the equipment, our science equipment and our chemistry labs? None of that has been fully fleshed out onto how we can do that effectively and in a safe manner. So, and all of that's going to, again, I hate to say it, take money. There has been a movement in our schools to do away with desks and let students have more free seating. I've seen bean bags and stools and things like that. Well, that's now not going to help when we're going to try to do social distancing. So it's really a paradigm shift on how we're going to change our schools and also meet the needs of our students and educators.
Tonya, you represent the parents, and schools can be open, but if parents don't believe it's safe to send their children to school, they're not going to want to send their children to school. The protection of their children's health It's going to be the number one issue. So how much confidence do you have that our school systems have in place adequate game plans in order to ensure the safety of our students if they open their doors?
Unfortunately, Senator Cardin, right now I have very little confidence. When MSDE initially issued their guidelines for reopening schools, we sent it out at Maryland PTA to all of our members and asked for comments. And we also asked our parents to email their comments to MSDE directly. And I've reviewed hundreds, if not thousands, of comments from parents. And I cannot tell you how many parents have threatened to disenroll their children from public school and do homeschooling for the next year. A number of parents have said just blatantly, I'm not sending my child to school if my child is not going to be protected. I've talked to a number of parents who have children with asthma or autoimmune diseases. So those children are now in a high risk category. And while the scientists say children are not as susceptible to coronavirus, those parents are saying, I disagree, because my child already has a weakened immune system, or my child already has a breathing issue. And so I believe my child is highly susceptible to coronavirus, and I'm not sending my child back to school if I cannot be certain that my child's not going to contract the disease there. We watched the demonstration that Montgomery County Public Schools did regarding transportation in the school buses. Well, a normal school bus on any normal school day would have maybe 35 to 40 kids on that bus. The demonstration that Montgomery County Public Schools did had it set up so that a child would sit on every other seat to meet the social distancing requirements. Well, now you've just cut that capacity of that bus down to 1/3 of what we would normally see or less. So now we have questions about whether we can transport the children and get them to school on time in a social distancing posture. That bus may have to run 4 or 5 times on that route to get all the students to the school. They're not going to get there on time. And in a normal circumstance, in ordinary times, last school year when we started off before coronavirus hit us, we were having problems in Maryland with transportation issues, not having enough bus drivers to meet the needs of transporting our children to school. Even in Prince George's County, I live in Prince George's County, we had a serious problem with students getting to school late in the morning, getting home late in the evenings because we didn't have enough transportation to meet the need. So now with coronavirus added to the equation, we definitely won't be able to get the students back and forth to school on time. And when you start talking about what we need to transport our students, if you're going to require a bus driver to check a child's temperature before he or she takes them to school, if the child shows up at the bus stop with a fever and mom or dad has gone to work for the day, what's the bus driver going to do? You can't leave that child at the bus stop unattended and nobody's at home to take care of the child's needs. We don't want to take the sick child to school and possibly make other children and staff sick. So it's like all of these questions are out there lingering and we don't have answers to them. And until we get those answers, I just don't see us reopening schools in 6 weeks and saying and convincing parents that our children are going to learn, they're not going to get sick, our teachers are going to be there for them, the cafeteria workers are going to be there to feed them, the maintenance staff is going to be there to clean up behind them. I just don't see it happening.
So as a general rule, the management and decisions of a school district is made by local government or the school boards of local government. So it's made at the county level in our state or Baltimore City. The state of Maryland has a major role to play in regards to the financing of public education, and they provide a significant amount of the resources. The national level the federal level has been somewhat limited. Yes, we have passed national laws to make it clear that education is our national priority. We have passed certain programs to deal with special needs, but the federal role has been more limited in regards to public education, pre-K through 12. We have provided, again, some special needs on pre-K. So Let me talk a little bit about where you would like to see the federal government lead in regards to how we deal with this pandemic in education. Secretary DeVos wants to get involved. President Trump says he wants the schools opened, and Secretary DeVos has indicated that perhaps she will use the federal funding stick as a tool to require schools to allow students to come back. Is that the right role for the federal government? What do you want to see come out of the Secretary of Education's office or the president in regards to how we reopen schools and the federal government's role in assisting in that regard? Cheryl, why don't we start with you?
Well, thank you for that question. Above all, we want education decisions to be made by educators, people who have actually been in our schools and teaching. And far too often, people are making important decisions and they have never stepped foot in a public school, let alone taught, made meals, cleaned, any of those things. So it's important that educators have a large voice in the role of what's taking place in our schools, and our parents should have a large role because it's their students that are attending these schools. So when the president and Secretary DeVos start making these pronouncements, they really have no idea what they're saying. And they don't, I don't think, understand the ripple effect of what that causes at the state and local level. I do want to commend Governor Hogan for saying that we won't be threatened into opening up our schools, because that should never be how we make a decision. We should make it based on health experts. So I'm disappointed. I hope that you and the other senators and Congress will help us with funding. We've never had our IDEA, which deals with special education, fully funded. We need additional money for Title I supports. We have to address the increases in concentrated poverty and the increases in homelessness that we see in our communities. This is growing. With the unemployment rate continuing to grow, we are going to need additional stimulus money for families. We fed over, I believe, 6 to 8 million students. I think it was 6 at the beginning of the summer, and we've continued to grow. We have many food insecure families. So we need Congress and the federal government to fund what they said they were going to fund. Let's start there. And then give us the additional money to address this crisis. The HEROES Act that was passed in the House has just been sitting. And we know Senator McConnell just is holding on to that and not providing. And that is a problem when we're trying to increase the number of safety procedures and protocols to put in place. The other thing is the rhetoric. Many of our educators are afraid of what we're going to do when students, supported by their parents, refuse to wear masks, refuse to use hand sanitizer, because our president has said it's a hoax. He has not worn a mask except for once in a hospital. So that modeling and that rhetoric filters down into our classrooms and just increases the anxiety. So federal funding of what's been mandated, federal funding for what we need during this crisis, and really better role models at the federal level.
Tonya, how do you feel about this?
As a parent, take our children out of politics. That's my first request. Our babies should never be political pawns. I'm a lawyer. However, public education is near and dear to my heart for a whole lot of reasons. My mother is a retired public school educator. So I've grown up around it all my life. I went to South Carolina Education Association meetings with her and to National Education Association conferences with her. So I know a lot about the public education system. I am a proud product, successful product of the public education system, both in South Carolina and in the state of Maryland. I believe in public education because I know it works. But what I also know is when times get tough, education is usually the first thing on the chopping block. That's got to stop. For instance, right here in my home state of Maryland, because Maryland is home for me now, when the Great Recession came, the state reneged on a promise to our children that was going to build the bridge to excellence. all of the money that was invested in making our education system equitable and fair and keeping it, maintaining it at the best level we could have in this nation was taken away from our children and never restored. When the statistics started to show nationally that our schools were failing 3-4 years ago, we decided to do another study. We got the results back. We were told by educational experts what we needed to do to bring our educational system in the state of Maryland back to the excellent standards it had been in years past. That required an investment in money. It required an investment in our teachers. It required an investment in career and college readiness for our children. It required providing the resources for our special needs population. Well, now we got this pandemic, and what happens? Again, education got chopped. It got chopped when our governor vetoed the blueprint implementation. That was the long-term plan that would have undergirded the foundations of our system here in Maryland and given our children the 21st century global education that they deserve, that is guaranteed under our state constitution. And then he proposed other major cuts to the current education budget. Now, while advocacy of educators and parents and other concerned citizens in Maryland stopped those cuts, while the CARES funding provided the additional resources that we need to prevent those cuts, there's still a possibility later this fall that the education funding that we have in place right now could be cut again. I ask, stop playing the political games with our children. There are other things that may have to be cut, but we cannot fail to educate our children and then complain about them when they don't meet the standards of excellence that we expect from them as adults. If we don't teach them, they'll never learn. If we don't invest in them, they're not going to do what it is we expect them to do. And I tell people, one day I want to retire. I'm paying my mama Social Security right now. I want my kids to be able to pay mine when I sit down and decide I'm not going to work anymore. And that's not going to happen if we don't give these children the opportunities that I had as a child so that they can be just as successful as I am.
Well, Tonya and Cheryl, thank you for that answer. I think you really laid it out. There's no question in my mind that education is the great equalizer and has to be our top priority. And it is clear that the primary responsibility has rested with state and local government for funding of education. The federal government has not played that significant of a role as the state and local governments have played. I'm a proud product of the Baltimore City public school system. So I owe a lot, as I think all of us recognize how our country has grown as a result of excellence in public education. And we got to make sure that we maintain that. I couldn't agree with you more, Tonya, when you talk about the Kirwan Commission and the vision of the Kirwan Commission to elevate the profession of educators and to make a long-term commitment to excellence in our schools. I introduced legislation in the Senate to complement the Kirwan Commission report with consequential grants to states that implement that type of a program. That was before COVID-19 struck. Now that, as you've pointed out, with COVID-19, there's the challenges of whether we can even maintain where we are today, let alone make the advancements that we need in public education. And that's something that we all need to be very, very mindful of. So what did we do in the CARES Act? The CARES Act recognizes that there was going to be additional cost involved in order to deal with the challenges of COVID-19. For state and local government, we provided the state of Maryland and its subdivisions over $2 billion of additional help to deal with the direct cost of COVID-19, so that dealing with the public health pandemic and the direct costs associated with it, it would not be a drag on the state's ability to finance its other obligations, including education. For our pre-K through 12 public schools, We provided in Maryland $252 million of direct assistance. That was good. This bill passed 96-0 in the Senate. Not controversial, bipartisan. Right thing to do. But what the CARES Act did not deal with is the fact that this was be an ongoing crisis. This pandemic would not be over by this time. When we passed it in March, we thought by July we would be back to somewhat of a normal existence. Obviously, that's not the case, far from the case. The CARES Act also did not provide any help for state and local government as a result of revenue declines. If you just common sense tells us with people unemployed, the amount of income tax revenues collected by the state of Maryland and by our local subdivisions is going to be dramatically less. The fact that they rely so heavily on use taxes from the hospitality industry, from tourism, all that has been very much compromised. Lack of conventions, and the list goes on and on and on, are affecting Baltimore City, every county in the state of Maryland's budget. They need direct help. So, with that in mind, the National Governors Association, led by our governor, Governor Hogan, Governor Cuomo of New York, submitted a request to Congress for $500 billion for the states alone. That didn't even include the subdivisions. The HEROES Act that passed the House of Representatives over a month ago provided direct help to our state and local governments so that they didn't have to make those cuts to public education, that they would have the resources necessary to maintain essential services, including our schools. And that would have provided substantial help. In Maryland, we would have gotten somewhere around $14 billion in state and local government help through the HEROES Act if it was passed by the Senate. But the HEROES Act also provided direct money to our schools in order to help in that regard, $900 million to Maryland schools. And that is a 2-year commitment. So it would get us through the entire school year, not end on October 1, or which is the end of our beginning of our next fiscal year. So that's where we did in order to be able to provide that type of support so that we could at least maintain our schools dealing with the extra costs of COVID-19, maintaining our commitment to fund public education, and yes, recognizing that we need to move forward, as Tonya so well pointed out. So that bill passed the House over a month ago. The Senate has not taken it up. I'm just telling you the current status. The current status is that the Senate, according to Leader McConnell, will take up a bill when we return on Monday that will be in the size of about $1 trillion. Compare that to the HEROES Act, which was $3 trillion. So we are far apart at this particular moment on how the federal government needs to respond. But the federal government needs to respond. The state of Maryland must have a balanced budget. Baltimore City must have a balanced budget. Baltimore County must have a balanced budget. Each one of our subdivisions must have a balanced budget. It's up to the federal government to make sure that the local governments can maintain their essential services. So when Secretary Bost talks about holding up money to our schools in order to deal with a political question, as Tonya so well pointed out, that is so outrageous. She should be advocating for funds so that our schools can maintain their ability to deal with the challenges that are out there. And I can tell you, we're going to fight for that. We're really going to fight for that. But I want to transition to an issue that worries me greatly. When it must have been March, maybe it was April, that Senator Van Hollen and I initiated phone calls with all of the superintendents of our schools in Maryland. And we also initiated calls with all the boards of education in Maryland in an effort to find out what we could do to help. And I want to tell you, the single most mentioned issue of trying to deal with the pandemic was the lack of capacity to make sure all students had access through virtual learning, the digital divide. And this was true in all 24 subdivisions. So as we reopen in a hybrid capacity, or we have to do more distance learning, or even if we open up in full pre-COVID environments, the need to connect students through the internet on distance learning is essential to have equality and opportunity in education. So I just want to hear how important or how great of a need is out there to make sure that our students have the technology and capacity and knowledge to be able to deal with connectivity through the internet as part of their learning experience. Cheryl, why don't you start us off?
Well, thank you. And thank you for outlining the federal funding and or lack thereof that we have. The digital divide is a high priority for districts, educators, and parents. We see it as a multifaceted issue. One is connectivity. Too many of our students are living, whether that's in an urban area or rural area, and they have no way to connect to the internet, which we see as an essential service. It is no longer your landline at your house because people don't have those. It is now the connectivity to the internet is the way that you can survive in our new world economy and our educational world. We need to work with our big cable providers to make sure that they're providing this, especially for our students living in poverty. We have homeless students who have no way of connecting. So connectivity is one. The other are devices. We are calling for every school district to go to a 1-to-1 device ratio, meaning every student has a tablet of some sort, and all educators and staff have that. We were doing surveys of our staff, and too many of them don't have access. We had a teacher in Dorchester County. She had to sit next to the school in her car. She was using the front seat to teach because that's where she could get connectivity. And her two students were in the back seat, her children, trying to learn through their tablets. That's not how we should be conducting education. We should be providing the internet. The other part, besides the connectivity and the actual hardware, is the cost of this. The cost of internet, we have to get a hold of that. We have to talk to our companies, but then we have to do education. Education to parents, education to students on platforms that they've never used before. In many of our schools, the carts, maybe 30 of them sit on a cart. I'm sorry, the computers sit on a cart, and you get to use it maybe during a class period, maybe not. Well, you don't have familiarity then on how to use the technology. So we need to beef up our education for our students, our parents, and our educators so they can wisely use the education. In Baltimore County in the spring, Senator Cardin, they estimate 3,500 students were never reached after we left our school buildings March 13th. So 3,500 students, and I believe that's an underestimate, were never educated beyond March 13th for this year. That is a disservice. That is something that we have to address immediately, and that's why it has to be a top priority to close the digital divide and get everybody into virtual learning and figure out all the bugs, figure out all the things that we need, but it's going to be a federal, state, and local initiative to close that divide. And the divide hits our students of color and our students living in poverty more than anyone else in our districts. So this goes into our institutional racism problem that we have in our country and in our schools, and it goes into our class system that we have established in this country. We pay more in education for our schools that service an affluent population than we do for schools that service students living in poverty. These things have to change.
Tonya, you want to respond?
Yes, and I thank you for that question. When the pandemic first kicked off, Maryland PTA did a survey of who had access, just like many of the school systems were doing surveys. And what we learned is in Western Maryland, from about the midpoint of Frederick County to West Virginia and beyond, there is no broadband internet infrastructure. And I was blessed after the town hall with Senator Van Hollen on the digital divide to get some information from an IT officer out in Allegheny County. And he explained that because they're out in the mountainous region, they even learned that hotspots don't work. Because as you go higher up in the elevation, they tend to get above the cell towers. So the signal is weakened there. So we know that the areas of the state out in the western regions, because they're elevated and they're out in the mountains, they don't even have reliable Wi-Fi. I also learned in this position that when you go toward our beach towns, out toward the Chesapeake Bay, toward the Atlantic Ocean, out on the eastern shore, they as well don't have the broadband high-speed internet infrastructure. And so those schools in those counties tend not to use technology to educate. Yes, that's a problem when you start talking about doing virtual learning. They don't have the ability to offer to our children the capability to do what our more urban school systems might have, or what those counties closer to the capital area have available to them. I was so happy to hear the Federal Communications Commission say high-speed broadband internet needs to be treated like electricity. Every home should have Cat5 cables and the capability to receive high-speed internet access, just like every home now is equipped with electrical power. I'm also happy to learn that the FCC has used its authority to issue grants in some rural areas to get that high-speed broadband access, but it's going to take a year or more to install the infrastructure. So in the meantime, I'm delighted to say, in talking to superintendents around the state, they have come up with some creative ways to get the internet access to those students who don't have them. And our teachers, our educators, our school administrators, they're doing the best they can with what we have. But we got to do better, because this is our new normal. So we've got to build our infrastructure. We've got to include our schools as a part of our infrastructure so that we can rehabilitate and renovate them so that all of our schools have high-speed broadband internet access, whether they're in a rural agricultural community or whether they're in a small beach town. They need to have the broadband access so the children can learn technology and have the ability to use the technology. Now I'm gonna do something that's gonna get me in trouble with my parents, but I gotta go there because I tell people I'm an equal opportunity person when it comes to holding us accountable. Parents have cell phones. Our children are smart. I have an 8-year-old in my home. I have one who's getting ready to go to college. And both of those children learned to use my cell phone quicker than I did. Many of our children have cell phones. I do not judge or question any parent's decisions when it comes to raising their children. But what I encourage parents to do is, instead of getting those baby cell phones for Christmas this year, get them a tablet. Get them a tablet. Reach out to Comcast because they have their Internet Essentials program where they're trying to offer internet access to those who don't have it at a more reasonable cost. Reach out to Comcast and claim the benefits that they're being offered. We encourage Verizon and our other telecommunications vendors in the area, do something similar. Offer a reasonably priced alternative to our families so that we can educate our babies during this pandemic. And I ask the parents to invest in it. I promise you it's the best investment you'll ever make.
Good advice. Let me point out, you're absolutely right about access to broadband. You have to have access to broadband. I've joined with Congressman Trone, who represents the western part of our state, in a request to the FCC to make sure we get the broadband infrastructure we need in the western part of our state, in the rural areas that don't have it today. We are now working with the EDA grants, the Economic Development Administration, to provide funding for the last mile connections for broadband in rural areas. But it's also a problem in every jurisdiction, including Baltimore City, because the providers are in business to make money. And if they don't see the economic return, they're not going to provide the type of connections to the homes that we need. So there is a service level, there's also an economic issue, and we don't have equal access in so many communities. And the point that Cheryl, you raised about that this is an inequitable distribution here, that when we find out, we talked a lot during the George Floyd tragedy about the injustice and systemic problems within the criminal justice system on racism, but the same problems exist in our schools, same problem exists in public health, same problems exist in housing, and that we have to recognize that this does not fall equally in our community. If you're poor, if you're a minority, you're going to be in a much worse shape. And during this pandemic, you're going to be hit harder, and the gap's going to grow unless we take aggressive steps to connect that. So it becomes even more urgent right now for us to deal with these issues. We have a question from the audience here, which Terry asks, if schools are not open, why do they need the same funding? Cheryl, you're up.
Okay, so we want to start with the understanding, as Tonya talked about, the Kerwin Commission examined our schools. Our schools are woefully inadequately funded currently, to the tune of over almost $4 billion a year. Our schools are underfunded. So we're starting at a deficit. And to go to virtual learning costs money, of all the things that we were just talking about, to make sure that we have devices for students, we have connectivity for students and educators. We're providing a new type of curriculum. So we've written curriculum for in-school teaching, which we know is the best and the most rigorous. And now we're trying to write curriculum and provide resources in a virtual world. We are also feeding more and more of our students, which costs money. In many of our rural areas, the bus drivers are taking the meals out to homes so that students can eat. So we're trying to deal with the basic needs of our students, and then trying to build up a different type of educational platform and delivery. All of this takes money. And again, we've been underfunded all along. And then we're going to add on top of that the need for masks and cleaning, and all of the things are going to go to maybe not the PPE that we see in health fields, but the PPE that's going to need to social distance. If you have a class of 30 students and we have to be 6 feet apart, first of all, we have to find the space for that. But then you're looking at a third of the class being taught at a time, while the other 2/3 have to be put somewhere. So we're going to need more people. We're going to need more places to put these folks, which all costs money. And I do want to add, we are at a time where we're in a teacher shortage. We see many people, even with this pandemic, retiring because this isn't what they wanted to do and they have the ability to retire. We have fewer teacher candidates coming in. Imagine being a first-year teacher and having to come in during this period. It's very difficult. So we are going to have to hire more staff. We're going to have to take on more cleaning, more resources in the protection and safety, and more in the virtual. So it does cost money. And here's the thing, we value education, or if we value education, we need to put our money and our priorities to education. As Tonya said, too often education is the first on the chopping block, the first that goes in funding. That needs to stop if we value education in this state and country.
Tonya, you want to add to that response?
Oh, absolutely. I agree with what Cheryl just said 100%. The other thing I would like especially our parents, to keep in mind when it comes to funding, and I'll even add to this, Senator Cardin, thanks to MSEA, there was a survey recently that included some parents. And I was so happy to hear our parents say that we don't spend enough money on K through 12 education. About 60% of parents who took that survey said that. We also had the majority of our parents to say they would be willing to pay more taxes to improve our public education system. That brought my heart joy because it tells me parents get it. And what I want everybody to understand right now is our schools are having to compete right now on the free market, just like the hospitals and everybody else, to get the PPE and the cleaning materials they're going to need for our schools during this pandemic. There is no single source for our educators to go to get Lysol and bleach and Pine Sol and whatever else they need to disinfect the desk and the keyboards and the hallways and the cafeteria tables. And just like I noticed I'm paying more for my groceries when I go to the store, I'm sure our school officials are going to have to pay more for the supplies that they buy for our students. I hear too many parents complain, and I'll raise my hand and say, I've been one of them as well. I hate getting that doggone supply list at the beginning of the school year. And I got to go buy 10 notebooks and a case of Kleenex and hand sanitizer. And sometimes I even send reams of copy paper to school because guess what? Our schools can't afford to buy it. So what do? They send a note home to the parents and say, this is the list of all the things we need you to bring for your child to be educated. Well, if we funded our schools properly, parents wouldn't have to pay the extra money to provide the supplies that our educators need to teach our children, the supplies that our children need to learn, and now the supplies that we need in our schools to keep our children safe and healthy.
Well, my guest today on Facebook Live, Cheryl Bost, who is the president of the MCEA, and Tonya Sweat from the Maryland PTA. This has been a great discussion. We have a specific question here I want to get to from Danelle LeClaire from University Park, Prince George's County. Asks, what are you doing at the federal level to help ensure kids with IEPs, 504 plans, get the help they need during distant learning? I think sometimes we lose sight of the fact that we have special needs out there and what is being done during the pandemic to try to deal with these children who have really strong, incredible vulnerabilities.
Yes, MSEA has been working closely with Marcella Frankowski at the State Department in trying to figure out all of the IEP process, 504s, all of those things that address the needs of our students with disabilities. There are a comprehensive set of guidelines that the State Department have put out. Our educators are trying to fulfill the individualized education plans, the IEPs. We believe that our students' IEP goals should still be met when they can in a virtual environment. If it involves maybe an occupational therapist, that makes it a little bit harder. And our special education students who can't continue to thrive as much as they need to or progress, we are looking at limited entry into the building with the correct safety precautions, with everything that is needed, that they might be the first to socially distance and get some services. It is a big issue. Funding is needed, especially for our infants and toddlers who deal with our youngest with special needs. IEPs are still in place. They're being met. We just ask for parents to have some grace with our teachers, but the Maryland State Department of Education and the MSEA website have good information on how we can fulfill IEPs during this distance learning period.
John Croca we have a question from John Croca from Boonesboro. Accumulating evidence of airborne transmissions of coronavirus is a central consideration for policymakers who decide if, when, how schools can reopen safely. How will this be addressed to protect students, teachers, staff, and their families? In other words, how will we make sure that our local school systems are tied in to the latest science information about coronavirus so that we can be nimble in the way that we conduct our schools?
So we are asking the stakeholder groups at each district to use health experts, local and state health experts. He brings up a good point. Many of our ventilation systems in our buildings, even the heating and air conditioning, every part of them are outdated. When the governor vetoed the blueprint for Maryland's future, it was also tied to the Built to Learn Act, which would have put money into enhancing and renovating our schools. So that money is gone right now. It is not an investment. So we're asking for ventilation systems to be certified. We need to look at our water in our schools. Too many of our students can't drink the water that's there because it has lead, it's brown, it's just really bad. And so they brought in bottled water. We do need to look at the airborne issue. And I want to say for our folks in Baltimore City, when we talk about these issues, they have it tenfold. When you go into some of the buildings in Baltimore City, we're ashamed that they're schools and we're sending our students to those buildings. The lead in the water, our students in Baltimore City have to take public transportation to get to schools. So that's a whole nother issue that we need to talk about for protection and cleanliness. But certification of ventilation systems is something that we are asking each of the districts to do as we try to move forward in opening up buildings.
A little bit about, Tonya, you already talked a little bit about the fact that school bus service will have to be changed to be safe. Cheryl, you mentioned the fact that we rely on public transit to get our students to school. But as we learn more and more about the coronavirus, we have to make sure that we respond in a timely way to keep our children and our educators safe. What can the PTA do to assist in making sure that we act upon the best science?
Well, Maryland PTA is going to keep doing what it's doing right now. We're going to stay engaged. We're going to continue to work with the Maryland State Department of Education. We were going to work with the Maryland State Department of Health and the Department of Family Services. We're going to work with our other education advocates and the educators and our other partners to ensure that we get this thing right. The other thing we're going to do is Maryland PTA is a part of a bigger network called the National PTA. And we're going to connect with our national partners, and we're going to continue to advocate at the federal level and in other states that we come up with a good, consistent plan that works for every child. Because we know in the United States, we're a very mobile population. I might be living in Maryland today. For all I know, I could be living in Virginia tomorrow or South Carolina the next month. We have military members that we represent who move every couple of years. And so their children also are very important to this equation. So we will be working within our national network to ensure that our schools open safely. That's a strong network. Parents have a voice in this. We are committed to using our voice. And I'll say this to you, Senator Cardin, and Cheryl, to you as an educator. If we have learned nothing else as parents during this pandemic, we have learned a greater appreciation for our teachers. And so we are more committed than ever to working with them to make sure we can give our children the best education possible. Because education, in my mind, is a three-legged tripod: the parent, the child, and the educator. If any of those legs break, the education doesn't happen.
I just want to make a final observation because I think this discussion has been so right on target. We need to get this pandemic under control. We've talked about how we keep our children safe by reopening our schools, and obviously that's the only way we can reopen our schools. We have to make sure it's safe for our children. But we also need to inform the public that wearing masks and distancing and getting this virus under control is not only important from your personal public health, but it also stops the spread of the virus and allows our children to be able to return to school earlier if we can control the virus. So if we want to get our country back on track, including schools being open for our students, as we saw before COVID-19, then we all really need to do our part in containing this virus by wearing masks, by social distancing, by avoiding large crowds, by doing what is expected of all of us, and recognize it's more than just how it affects me personally. It's more than how it affects my grandparents. It's also how it affects our children. We're all in this together, and we really need to recognize that we have immediate problems in making sure our students are safe, our educators are safe, but we have to work in the broader context to make sure we get this pandemic under control by doing our part. I want to thank both of our guests today. I think this has been an incredibly timely and important subject. As we said originally, all of us want our schools to open as soon as possible, but it must be done in a safe manner. Cheryl Bost, who is the president of the MCEA, Tonya Sweat, who is from the Maryland PTA vice president. Thank you both for joining me today on Facebook Live, and I want to thank you all for viewing us today. Everybody stay safe, and we'll have another conversation shortly. Thank you.